Götz von Berlichingen was a German imperial knight in the Holy Roman Empire, famed for his iron prosthetic hand and his daring exploits in battle. Born into a noble but modest Franconian family in modern-day Baden-Württemberg, he grew up in an era of constant local wars and feuds. As a young man, he entered the service of high-ranking nobles. By 1497, he was serving Margrave Frederick of Brandenburg-Ansbach, and a year later he fought in campaigns under Emperor Maximilian I. By 1500, Götz had left formal service to form his own band of mercenaries, hiring out his sword to various dukes and barons. This independent streak and martial skill quickly earned him renown and a rise to prominence among the warrior nobility of southern Germany. Throughout his 47-year career, Götz von Berlichingen was involved in numerous conflicts and private feuds that were common in the fractious Holy Roman Empire. He claimed to have fought in at least 15 feuds under his own name, often leading a personal troop of armed followers. These feuds pitted him against powerful cities and lords. For example, in 1512 he waylaid a caravan of wealthy merchants from Nuremberg, an act that provoked Emperor Maximilian to make Götz an outlaw until he paid a heavy fine. A few years later, in 1516, Götz quarreled with the Archbishop of Mainz. During that feud, he captured a nobleman and held him for ransom, which again led to him being declared an outlaw again, this time until 1518. Götz didn't shy away from larger-scale conflicts either. In 1519, he joined Duke Ulrich of Württemberg in war against the Swabian League, a powerful alliance of imperial cities and princes. Götz commanded the defense of the fortress of Mockmühl, but was eventually forced to surrender due to lack of supplies. Despite being promised safe conduct, he was arrested and handed over to his enemies. He secured release in 1522, only after paying ransom and swearing an oath not to seek revenge. In 1525, during the German Peasants' War, the rebel peasants in the Odenwald region pressed Götz to be their commander. He reluctantly accepted leadership of the peasant army, hoping to restrain their excesses, but found them beyond control. After about a month, he abandoned the rebels and returned to his castle, declaring he never truly supported their cause. That said, his brief and open support of the peasants, along with his conflicts with the wealthy and powerful, led him to be held in high esteem amongst the peasantry. Following the suppression of the revolt, Götz was called to account at the Diet of Speyer. He was acquitted in 1526, but the Swabian League later lured him to Augsburg under false pretenses and imprisoned him from 1528 to 1530 as retaliation for past grievances. In 1540, Emperor Charles V finally enlisted the aging knight in imperial service. Götz campaigned against the Ottoman Turks in Hungary in 1542 and fought in the emperor's invasion of France in 1544. Only after these campaigns did he retire to his family castle for a more peaceful life at the ripe age of 64. Throughout these conflicts, Götz cultivated a reputation as a fearless, though often lawless knight who stood up to powerful authorities. He was known to rob or ransom the rich while often sparing or even aiding ordinary peasants, which earned him a folk hero status as a kind of German Robin Hood in popular legend. One of the most defining episodes in Götz von Berlichingen's life occurred in 1504 during the War of the Succession of Landshut. While fighting at the Siege of Landshut in Bavaria, the 23-year-old knight was struck by an enemy cannonball, severing Götz's right arm at the wrist. Losing a sword hand in the early 16th century generally ended a warrior's career, if not his life. For Götz, however, this injury was a setback he refused to let define him. Remarkably, he recovered from the wound and almost immediately sought a way to continue fighting. He commissioned an iron prosthetic hand to replace the lost one, allowing him to return to the battlefield despite his disability. The loss of his natural hand did little to slow Götz's martial pursuits, and he retrained himself to wield a sword with his left hand. This resilience in the face of such an injury added to his renown and the dread he inflicted upon opponents. In his later years, Guts would even boast that his artificial hand, quote, rendered more service in the fight than ever did the original flesh. Guts's iron hand was an extraordinary feat of engineering for the early 1500s. In fact, he had two prosthetic iron hands made over time. The first iron hand, crafted soon after his 1504 injury by a local blacksmith, was a relatively simple device. It featured four movable fingers shaped like hooks, with two hinges at the knuckles, so that Guts could bend them inward to grip a shield. Importantly, while some modern sources imply that he gripped his sword with this iron fist, this was never the case. After some years of continued combat using the first prosthetic, Guts upgraded to a more advanced model. His second iron hand, made sometime in the 1520s, was a marvel of Renaissance metalwork. This version extended further up his forearm and was secured with leather straps for stability. Unlike the first prosthetic, the second hand had articulated joints for each finger and thumb, allowing a much greater range of grip positions. Guts could use his good left hand to bend and position the metal fingers of the prosthetic into a desired grip, and an internal mechanism would lock the fingers in place. The combination of hinges, ratchets, and springs meant Guts's iron hand could achieve both cosmetic and functional purposes. It looked roughly like a gauntleted hand and could perform practical tasks of grasping or holding objects. The successful construction of such a sophisticated prosthetic limb in the early 16th century was made possible by the era's advances in metalworking and mechanical engineering. Master armorers and locksmiths of the early modern period were highly skilled. They could forge articulated armor, craft weapons with trigger mechanisms, and build early clocks with gears and springs. Guts's iron hand applied these same principles on a smaller scale, effectively making him one of the first recorded users of a functional biomechanical prosthesis. Had he been born just a couple decades earlier, this legendary knight would have never been. Today, both of Guts von Berlichingen's iron hands survive and are on display at his family castle in Jagdhausen, Germany. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Also make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you're always notified whenever I drop new content. Also, if you didn't know, I also have my main channel, Lazy Chill Zone, which has hundreds of hours of content on mysteries, crime, and more. Beneath the waters of the Sea of Galilee lies a colossal structure that has mystified scientists since its discovery. This underwater anomaly is massive, ancient, and purposefully built, raising more questions than answers about the region's distant past. The Sea of Galilee is a freshwater lake in northern Israel, through which the Jordan River flows. In the summer of 2003, a routine sonar survey of the lake's southwestern floor detected something wholly unexpected, a massive circular anomaly on the otherwise smooth basin. Subsequent dives confirmed the presence of an enormous pile of stones, arranged in a cone-shaped formation, rising about 30 feet from the lake bed. Measuring roughly 200 feet in diameter, about twice the width of Stonehenge's outer stone circle, and weighing an estimated 60,000 tons, the structure dwarfs most modern-day warships in mass. Its sheer size and hidden location immediately captured researchers' attention, and archaeologists were left puzzled as to its purpose and age. Divers who inspected the site found it to be composed of unhewn basalt boulders up to 3 feet long, piled atop one another with no obvious pattern or chisel marks. In essence, it's a giant rock cairn, a heap of stones lacking discernible walls or corners, yet clearly man-made in origin. Notably, the basalt rock is foreign to the immediate lake vicinity. While basalt is common in the surrounding Golan Heights, It doesn't naturally lie in the Sea of Galilee's basin. This indicates the stones were deliberately hauled to the site from over a mile away. The structure's builders, whoever they were, undertook a monumental task of transporting and piling these heavy rocks underwater, or on land that later became submerged. From the outset, researchers have virtually unanimously agreed on a human origin for this structure. So the big question has been, when was it built and why? These questions have proven difficult to answer. Based on the accumulation of sediment around its base, scientists estimate that the stone pile has sat underwater for several millennia. One analysis of sediment buildup suggests the structure could have been constructed anywhere from 2,000 to 12,000 years ago, a broad range that indicates significant uncertainty. Many archaeologists have tentatively dated it to the early Bronze Age, approximately 3000 to 2000 BC. This is largely due to its proximity to well-known Bronze Age settlements and the presence of similar megalithic monuments in the region. For example, the large fortified city of Bet Yera thrived about a mile from the site. Further, a 5,000-year-old stone circle complex found nearby this city attests to a local tradition of massive stone constructions. The effort required to build the submerged cairn, hauling tens of thousands of tons of rock and piling them high, implies a complex, well-organized society with advanced planning skills. Researchers have proposed several ideas about what this enigmatic structure might have been used for. Many cairns around the world serve as markers for burials or tombs. The Galilee structure's resemblance to ancient burial mounds in Europe hints that it might have been a massive tomb or memorial for the dead. Indeed, similar stone heaps are often used to mark burials, though researchers have not yet confirmed if this was the case here. Another theory suggests it could have been a ritual site used by the nearby settlement. Its proximity to the early Bronze Age city of Bet Yera suggests it might have held ceremonial significance or served as a public monument associated with that town. Without artifacts, its exact role is unclear, but it may have been a gathering place or a foundation for some long-lost structure important to the local society. However, this theory assumes that the anomaly was above water at the time, which itself hasn't been proven yet. Perhaps the most interesting theory is that the cairn was used as an early form of aquaculture. Piles of stones can create sheltered habitats for fish breeding, and such stone fish nurseries were known in the Sea of Galilee region in antiquity. This theory posits that the structure could have been an ancient fisherman's installation to enhance fish stocks. However, if this is the case, this structure is much larger than other similar structures found in the region. Despite these intriguing theories, the true nature of the Sea of Galilee anomaly remains unresolved. To date, no artifacts have been recovered from the site to conclusively determine its age or the identity of its builders. Archaeologists emphasize that only a dedicated underwater excavation will yield definitive answers, yet such an endeavor is both logistically challenging and costly. The structure lies under 30 feet of water, where visibility is extremely low, and any disturbance kicks up clouds of silt, complicating excavation efforts. Furthermore, a full-scale dig would require significant funding and specialized equipment, a fact which experts believe to be unlikely. Despite the Sea of Galilee likely containing significant historically valuable artifacts, no underwater archaeological digs have ever taken place there. Henry Hudson's disappearance in the early 17th century remains one of history's most intriguing maritime mysteries. Hudson was a renowned English navigator who ventured into uncharted waters during the Age of Exploration. He made significant discoveries in North America, yet his final voyage ended in mutiny and an uncertain fate. Before his ill-fated final voyage, Henry Hudson had already made 3 notable expeditions. In 1607 and 1608, sailing for English merchants, he attempted to find a northeast passage to Asia across the Arctic, but each time his path was blocked by impenetrable ice. In 1609, now backed by the Dutch East India Company, Hudson turned westward in search of a northwest passage. He crossed the Atlantic and explored the North American coast, venturing into present-day Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay. He then sailed up a great river in what would later be New York. That river would later be named the Hudson River in his honor. Although he never did find a new route to Asia, Hudson became the first European to map the Hudson River, and he claimed the surrounding territory for the Netherlands. This achievement cemented his reputation as an accomplished explorer. News of Hudson's discoveries soon made him a figure of keen interest in England. Determined not to lose such a talented explorer to a rival nation, English investors quickly arranged a new expedition for Hudson under their flag. In 1610, with the backing of the Virginia Company and the British East India Company, Henry Hudson set sail once more, a voyage that would tragically be his last. Hudson's final expedition departed England in April 1610 aboard the ship Discovery. He led a crew of about 24 men, including his teenage son John. Their goal was to locate a westward route to Asia through the Arctic waters of North America. By midsummer 1610, Hudson navigated Discovery through the icy channel, now known as Hudson Strait, at the northern tip of Labrador, and entered a vast inland sea. This was Hudson's first view of what would later be called Hudson Bay. And yeah, if you haven't gathered it by now, this guy was kind of a big deal in terms of exploration. Believing this enormous bay might be the long-sought Pacific Passage, Hudson eagerly charted its coastline for months. As autumn set in without any sign of an outlet to the Pacific, the realization dawned that the bay was landlocked. In November, the Discovery became trapped by thick ice in the far south of Hudson Bay, near James Bay. Hudson and his crew were forced to winter in the unforgiving wilderness. The crew's situation over the winter of 1610 to 1611 was dire. They hauled the ship ashore and hunkered down on the desolate coast to wait for spring. Freezing temperatures, dwindling food supplies, and outbreaks of scurvy tormented the men. Morale plummeted as the starving crew grew increasingly resentful, blaming Hudson's relentless quest for a passage for their misery. By the time the ice began to thaw in June 1611, many of the men were weak, desperate, and ready to return home at any cost. Hudson, however, was not ready to abandon his mission and apparently had little to no ability to read the room, or read the deck as the situation may have been. Even after the horrible winter, he wanted to continue exploring westward once the bay cleared of ice. Most of his crew vehemently disagreed. They demanded to sail back to England immediately. This clash set the stage for a mutiny. On June 22, 1611, as the Discovery prepared to get underway, the disgruntled crew seized their chance to rebel. The mutineers took control of the ship and overpowered those still loyal to the captain. In the aftermath of the mutiny, the mutineers cast Henry Hudson, his son John, and a handful of loyal crew adrift in a small open boat. The rebels supplied the castaways with only minimal provisions and then cut the rope, leaving them behind in the middle of Hudson Bay. And yes, it feels odd to say they left Henry Hudson in the middle of Hudson Bay, but it is what it is. Hudson and the 8 others with him in that tiny boat were never seen again. As Hudson's abandoned boat faded from view, the Discovery, now under the mutineers' command, set sail for England. The Discovery reached England later that year, with only 8 crewmen remaining. The survivors were arrested and put on trial for the slaying of Henry Hudson, but in the end, none were punished due to lack of proof and conflicting testimonies. To put it simply, the seamen were all over the place, and no one wanted to deal with cleaning up that mess. The mutineers claimed they had simply marooned their captain, not snuffed him out. With Hudson himself missing and unable to tell his side of the story, the true events of the mutiny remained murky. What ultimately happened to Henry Hudson and the men set adrift with him remained an open question that would haunt history. The mystery of Henry Hudson's disappearance has spawned numerous theories about what happened after he was cast adrift. Because no definitive evidence of Hudson or his crew was ever found, historians and adventurers have hypothesized several possible fates. One theory suggests Hudson was never actually set adrift at all, but rather he was slain by the mutineers during the takeover. Some very suspicious evidence was noted when the Discovery returned. For instance, there were bloodstains on the deck that no one seemed to have an explanation for. And I really have to question why these seamen couldn't think up a plausible excuse for the stains during their months-long voyage back to the homeland. After all, the forensic technology at the time was, well, let's just call it limited. It's possible the mutineers concocted the story of setting Hudson loose to hide the true story. However, without bodies or eyewitnesses beyond the mutineers themselves, this theory remains speculative. Other theories propose that Hudson and his companions survived for a time after being marooned. Given their proximity to land, they might have reached the shores of James Bay. In fact, years later, in 1631, explorer Thomas James reported finding the remains of a crude shelter on an island in James Bay, perhaps built by Hudson's stranded party. Some believe the castaways could have been rescued or captured by indigenous peoples, and there's actually way more evidence for this than you might think. Cree oral traditions speak of a stranded group of white men who were either captured or rescued, depending on the telling. However, given the oral nature of these legends, it's unclear what time period this is referring to. French explorer Samuel de Champlain in 1613 recorded hearing of an English boy taken in by the Algonquin people after a shipwreck in the far north. Notably, in the 1950s, a stone was found in Deep River in Ontario with the initials HH and the year 1612. Adding more interest to the narrative, the stone also had the words "captive" etched into it. Notably, no one has been able to determine when this carving was actually made. Others suspect that Hudson, his son, and remaining crew simply died of exposure, given that they were left with almost no supplies. Even though this is the least interesting theory of all, it's the one I tend to prefer, since the crew members themselves openly stated they gave them very little in the way of goods to survive on. And this was the crew members' version of events trying to make themselves look at least somewhat good and reasonable under the circumstances.